Cool. Okay. How's everyone doing? My name is Jamie. I'm with Across Protocol. I'm a senior software engineer, and I've been at the protocol for almost 3 years now. Like a lot of us, I came from Web 2, and I found my way into Web 3, and I never looked back. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk about bridging the gaps and to take a bit of a journey with y'all through data-driven exploration to see how cross-chain inefficiencies exist in the landscape today and how we can solve them and how we have solved them at Across Protocol. So I'd like to take you first with the 30,000-foot view. Why does cross-chain movement matter? In a multi-chain reality, we exist with fragmented liquidity. And specifically liquidity, it's more fragmented than ever. It spans many chains. You have layer 2s, you have alt chains, you have rollups, you have mainnet, you have orbit chains, layer 3s. There's so many. And to exist in this world is to have this liquidity be bucketed into these different chains. And what we keep consistently seeing is that traditional bridging is falling short. So what is traditional bridging? Most of us know this as the manual approach to going to a bridge, a canonical bridge, clicking through all the buttons, getting your funds from A to B, and then going from that point forward and manually completing your transaction. Maybe you go to an app, maybe you mint an NFT, etc. So there's many cases. But what users seem to be increasingly looking forward to, and how we can see this chart, it's basically parabolic, is that users want a seamless, direct access way to get into these dApps using liquidity and funds from any chain. So you want that seamless start on an origin, end on a destination, with almost taking out the idea of that we've abstracted chains. So what Across has looked at is removing that friction through intents. Basically, what we're going to talk about today is how the concept of users defining their outcome and having solvers, these cross-chain, off-chain pieces of software, go ahead and execute that action on the behalf of the user. So the whole process is abstracted into basically a couple of button clicks. So when we talk about Across, when we talk about cross-chain interop, we think solvers, but in the world of Across, we like to think the word relayer is more accessible. So TLDR, solvers and relayers, which is the same thing in our case, is the backbone of intent-based execution. They're intent solvers, they're off-chain, and they rapidly fill these user intents from origin to destination. The premise for Across has always been, our core thesis is that the more solvers we have, the faster the execution, the lower the costs, and the better the reliability of the entire ecosystem as a whole. Relayers are decentralized, they're competitive, and they're permissionless. They're also essential for scaling cross-chain user experience. Having these multiple permissionless relayers execute throughout our network gives users deeper liquidity on popular routes, deeper liquidity on routes that are more long-tailed, and provides a seamless bridging experience that's fast, cost-effective, and highly available. So we've talked about intents. We've talked about sort of what Across is, this intent-based cross-chain bridge. Where are the gaps when we talk about cross-chain liquidity? Well, at the crux, the idea here is that solver participation varies by route. High participation on high-demand routes causes solvers to come into the space and make those liquidity reserves deep and provides fast and reliable bridging experiences for the user. However, on the flip side, on this bimodal graph, we see that lower participation on these emerging routes tends to lead to lower traffic for user demand, which does not attract as many solver networks, which lowers the liquidity and makes the initial transaction with low volume, with fewer solvers, slower execution, and higher costs. So we see this idea of this bimodal aspect of cross-chain bridging, where on one hand you have the arbitrums, you have the major L2s, mainnets, where everything is concentrated and there's tons of liquidity. On the other hand, you see these long tail assets where it's not as it's not as deep. So where does this pose a benefit for solvers? Well, these underserved routes, these long tail assets getting from the smaller chains to the bigger chains maybe, or the smaller chains to the smaller chains, they present an opportunity for these solvers to enhance efficiency, to compete for these potentially less competitive routes, and to earn these fees. In doing so, I mean, the general consensus here is that their solver, it increases the overall ecosystem of, in general. Sorry. Okay, so let's take a stop here. Let's talk about what's going on with these low participation routes. What we have here is actually a cold start problem. So we have low participation on smaller routes. But how do we solve this? Well, one of the solutions is project-led relaying. So what I mean by this is projects, they want to come into the Across ecosystem, into this decentralized interop system, and they want to access the liquidity of other chains, but they don't necessarily have there aren't existing relayers in the space. So what projects can do is they can actually run their own relayers, because relaying is permissionless, and the more relayers on a specific route improve the total amount of liquidity, and it also increases the amount of the speed and the cost to getting to those routes. So what we see is an alignment of ecosystem incentive. Projects directly incentivize this solver participation, which boosts the decentralized bridging effort as a whole. We see that cross-chain liquidity and user experience is improved. This project-led relaying, it improves, as I mentioned, the liquidity depth. But it also improves the transaction times and increases the UX in general, because these projects have an alignment and an incentive to promote the routes that they need the most. And what you get is the sustainability usage of treasury funds. So these projects can park some of their funds to improve their own user experience to get to this cross-chain world, while they're also generating healthy APY to incentivize their use of relaying. So we talked about the idea of projects leading this relaying, but what about another option? How about the community-led relaying? So this is actors in the space that aren't necessarily associated with a single project. This is somebody who's interested in the space potentially, or they're an engineer who wants to diversify their holdings in crypto. They can, because Across our canonical relayer is fully open source, anyone can come to the system and in a permissionless way inject liquidity through and by running their own relayer, and support the thriving relayer community that exists and improve user experience as a whole. And what we see is this relayer community has matured in Across to the point where through the community and project-led support on Discord, community office hours, and dedicated dashboards, we see that the solvers have gained this intimate knowledge of the protocol that it improves the ecosystem of relayers by providing them access and information that they may not have known while this infrastructure was becoming more mature. The best part is relayers are permissionless, so anyone is incentivized and encouraged to join the space. There's no opt-in, there's no whitelisting. So if you have a need and you have a want, you can get started as a community to run a relayer. So before we jump into the case studies that I had mentioned in the beginning, I just want to talk a little bit more about this notion of community-driven data tools. So what you see right here is a piece of software, a dashboard that community relayers have actually built to monitor liquidity, transactions, and performance in real time. What we'll see here is that this knowledge of the protocol extends beyond the basic need to be able to run a relayer to the point where you can see that these community solvers have figured out when liquidity is removed from the system through means of filling user intents, and when liquidity gets reintroduced into the system by means of relayer refunds that make the relayers whole and allow them to have more liquidity to continue to relay user funds. Okay, now, we talked about the cold start problem of low liquidity, low solver participation. Let's flip it on the head. Let's talk about the idea and the challenges of high competition, value leakage. What you see is in the across system, because of the permissionless nature, relayers are first come, first serve. There's one deposit that gets made on the origin chain, and only one deposit or one fill that could be made on the destination. So what you see is multiple relayers vying for a single route, and what this does is it leads to transaction failures and potential reverts, and it takes value by wasting gas, and it removes that liquidity from the system. What has Across done as one of the mechanisms to reduce this? We introduced something called a nomination system. So for a small percentage of order flow, one relayer is nominated for a very small amount of time to have the ability to make a fill in that window without having any potential reverts because they are entitled to that fill. I'm going to skip ahead just because once this nomination window ends, if a solver does not come to the table, what we'll actually see is that first come, first serve is resumed, and relayers can now vie for this deposit. So in a decentralized way, what we see is that we're able to maintain this performance, this speed advantage, but we're able to also consider the relayer and consider the value that they might be potentially burning through wasted gas costs. And since it's a small fraction of order flow, we still maintain a very healthy decentralized relayer network. Okay, so we're here. We just talked about the issues of the cold start. We talked about the issues of the value leakage. We've discussed how important cross-chain movement matters today. What I would like to do is take you briefly through 3 case studies where Across has seen our core thesis be validated time and again, that more demand equals more solver participation. Let's start with WorldChain. So WorldChain was a situation where we had advanced solver coordination and before we launched, and that led to efficient execution. What we can see is from basically day one, all of our relayers turned online, or at least some of these in this example, they turned online, and the coordinated launch and the strong user demand led to immediate solver engagement. And we had this strong competitive execution cycle from day one, which improved user experience still to this day. Additionally, we can talk about Unichain. So Unichain was a situation where immediate user demand drove solver engagement in a way that we hadn't seen before. Unichain was a high-profile integration for Across, and the incredibly strong user demand initially, and due to the prominent nature of Uniswap itself, we immediately had a solver network jump into the system and inject liquidity into the chain, into this route, where our P90 fill time was immediately under 10 seconds. So in 10 seconds, a user could make a bridge deposit on any chain and receive user funds on Uniswap or Unichain and vice versa due to this solver execution, due to this deep liquidity pool that we saw with Uniswap. And finally, let's talk Hyperliquid. So Hyperliquid is a bit of a different aspect. It's how Across was able to get to Hyperliquid from any chain into Hyperliquid through immediate instant solver liquidity. And what I mean by that is that Hyperliquid is a bridge within a bridge. It's like bridgeception in a way. What we have is that Hyperliquid exists with a canonical bridge on Arbitrum. So using Across v3's embedded actions, where you can bottle and contain a cross-chain bridge plus a same transaction fill with an arbitrary payload, what we can have is that any relayer that can support flows into Arbitrum can receive user flows and then execute a transaction that takes the user fund from Arbitrum as an intermediary and flows it into Hyperliquid. And due to this Across embedded action system, it's able to natively execute that bridge request with these custom payloads on the destination chain, which was Arbitrum. And this is something that's completely open source and documented, and many internal and external projects have integrated with this. But Hyperliquid is an awesome example of how we were able to get solver liquidity immediately with networks that already existed. So, does anyone have any questions? We're just going to skip that last slide.
APRs which were displayed on slides. I saw 60+% APR for a solver. Are these real numbers?
Yeah, that's a dashboard screenshot I took a couple days ago from this relayered community dashboard.
Okay, I have a follow-up question to this, which was, sorry, right in front of me. Okay, no more time, no more time.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciated being here. Thanks.